Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the third day of the San Antonio Book Festival. I hope that folks have had an opportunity to jump into a number of sessions. There's so many great authors that were featured at this year's San Antonio Book Festival. I just want to thank all of the organizers of the book festival. I know how hard they work each and every year to put together an excellent event. And this year, being a virtual book festival, I'm sure had its challenges, but I have to say that they've pulled it off so admirably. And all of the authors that have been featured have been fascinating and I think have resonated with a lot of the audience. It's my pleasure today to sit down with an author who has a special place in my heart because I had the chance to work with her for several years when I was the mayor of San Antonio and she was the city manager of our city. Sheryl Sculley has written a book with a provocative title called Greedy Bastards, and I'm going to ask her about that title. But first, let me tell you a little bit about Sheryl, who I respect tremendously. She had a 4-decade career in city management from Kalamazoo to Phoenix, Arizona, to more than a decade here in San Antonio, Texas. It's safe to say that it's fair to say that she is one of the most accomplished city managers in modern municipal history. And we're going to get into a conversation about some of the highs and lows and great stories that she tells in the book. Here in San Antonio, she arrived in 2005 under the leadership of Mayor Hardberger, had the opportunity to work with Mayor Hardberger, with myself as mayor, and then with Mayor Ivy Taylor, and with Ron Nirenberg, the current mayor of San Antonio. During that time, the city was praised for the professionalization of the city organization, for reaching a AAA bond rating, and a number of other things that we'll talk about. Now, the title of the book, I'll ask you, Sheryl, I'll give a little bit of a hint, relates to the city's relationship and negotiations with the police union, which is a very timely topic. Sheryl, thank you so much for joining us, for being a part of the book festival. I know that you did a whirlwind tour of talking about the book, but let me just start by saying, where did you get the idea for this title, Greedy Bastards? Because most people think of city management, that's not the most exciting, topic for a lot of folks, unless you're like us and you're into, cities and how they run. But you actually picked up the title in an interesting real life way. How'd you get it?
Well, thank you, Secretary, Mayor, and friend Julian Castro. I appreciate your moderating this session today, and thank you to the Book Festival as well for hosting and talking about my book, Greedy Bastards, One City's Texas-Sized Struggle to Avoid a Financial Crisis. And I cannot take credit for the title of the book entirely. In fact, it was inspired by the police union president who accused my team and I of portraying the union as greedy bastards as we began to look at how to remodel the union contracts that had been in place since 1988 and left unattended surely would have bankrupt the city by as soon as 2024. And so as we took on this issue, the union, of course, didn't like that. And I remember seeing a video of the union president from a press conference, and he uttered those words, "She thinks we're greedy bastards, but we're not." And I remember when my staff shared it with me and showed it to me, I said, if I ever write a book, he just gave me the title. And that was back in 2014. So here we are in 2021, my book published, of course, last summer in August of 2020, but I kept the title. And I give him proper credit, of course, in the book as well.
Absolutely. And my understanding is that you've had some interesting response, even in the media, to the title of the book.
Yes. In fact, it's interesting because more recently, one of the staff writers at the New York Times had read my book, and he and a team of reporters at the New York Times were doing a series of articles about police unions across the country, specifically about police accountability. And they had analyzed a number of cities. He had read my book and called and interviewed me back in December. And then after that interview, and he had quoted me in the article that published back then, they decided they wanted to focus on San Antonio and talk about how did these contracts get started and what was the genesis for all of that. So they worked on a story, and of course talked about the union's chief negotiator, who also had written several books about how to fight City Hall when elected officials, mayor, you were mayor at the time when we took on this issue, and how to fight city managers and keep what you have and those tactics. And then it talked about our story as well. And they told the title of his book in this front page article in the Times on March 11th. But then they wouldn't use the title of my book and told me that the New York Times is a family-owned paper and that they couldn't use the word bastards in the story. But they did say that I wrote a book. They just didn't repeat the title. But other than that, all the other media has used the title, and most people have been very responsive and positive about the title. And it is an eye catcher for sure.
Well, and I want to delve into your relationship with the San Antonio Police Officers Association, and more broadly, really the work that you and the city management team did to identify some of the shortcomings of the police contract. This is an issue that is right at the top of people's attention in San Antonio right now. There's a group called Fix SAPD that launched a petition effort, which will be on the May 1st ballot. I think early voting starts April 19th, just in a few days, which
That's
would
right.
address basically the ability of police officers to collectively bargain as a way to try and get more transparency and accountability. Talk to me about how you came to focus on the police union contract, and also about your relationship with the San Antonio Police Officers Association.
Well, I certainly, as you know, didn't come to San Antonio to become a public safety villain. I highly regard the work of our first responders. They have difficult jobs, and the vast majority of them do an excellent job. The union leadership, I spent time, and I remember before I even was officially on the job, I was coming into town every other week to get ready and get some things going. And one of the people that was identified for me to meet with, that I was interested in meeting with, was the police union president. We sat down at one of the local restaurants downtown and had a beer on a Saturday afternoon, talked about the needs, and I wanted to know what they thought from their perspective. And we had a very good working relationship. I did with the union until I took on this issue, and then they didn't really like that because they didn't want to change what had been in place for 25 years. But we had a good working relationship and made lots of changes. As you know, we added many more police and fire personnel, almost 700 during my tenure. As a growing community, we were understaffed, but it also had to be affordable to the taxpayers. And we needed changes in police accountability, in the disciplinary process. So, Mayor, when you were mayor, we talked about that, and my staff and I spent a tremendous amount of time developing a business case that we presented to you. You asked a lot of tough questions. We had to put the numbers together, and in part, this became especially evident during the Great Recession. We did not raise taxes, as you know, and so year over year, we were collecting less revenue. And because of those very strict union contracts with police and fire, we were not able to make any changes there, and that burden then fell a minority of the general fund budget, and we had to make cutbacks in services, street maintenance, and community facility hours and library hours. And the community didn't want those reductions, but we were really bound. And so we focused on how do we remodel those contracts, not take away from the officers, but change the business model so that it was more affordable and that it wouldn't bankrupt the city. You may remember we presented at a budget a projection. When would public safety become 100% of the general fund budget? Because their expenses were outpacing our general fund revenues. And based on a 10-year analysis, it showed that by 2031, all the city would do would be public safety. Now, you and I both know we wouldn't let that happen to the community, but the choices then were to raise taxes or to continue to cut back in other areas. So we decided and knew from our experience in changing and updating our healthcare model that we would tackle those most expensive elements of that budget for public safety to make the changes. But in addition to that, as you know, we had a list of items that we also thought needed to be changed. That is the disciplinary process for bad police officers. We have a system today where arbitrators can overturn decisions that the police chief makes to discipline officers. And sometimes we get bad actors who we can't even put back out on the street because we think they may be a danger to our community, and so they work in administrative jobs. But the police chief needs more authority for police accountability. And I know that Chief McManus, who was one of the first people I recruited to San Antonio through a competitive process, I know that he believes he needs greater police accountability. And there are only two ways to go about that. We either negotiate the changes with the unions, with the union, police union, or we have to rescind collective bargaining. And we are a right to work state. And I should say too, as you know, Mayor, Secretary, that I come from a union background. My dad was a union member, a union leader. I grew up in the Chicago area. I am not anti-union. I worked the first 15 years of my career in Michigan, one of the toughest labor states in the country, and had a very good working relationship with my unions there. But what was going on here was unsustainable, and we definitely needed to change that disciplinary process. So those are the two alternative ways that we can do it. And so far, the unions have not agreed to make the changes that the current administration at City Hall is requesting.
Yeah, so we have these sort of two big issues, one of them fiscal, which was a lot of the focus, I think, that you write about and the push back then to try and contain costs. I remember the analysis that you're talking about. I think it said that something like 66 or 67% of the overall city budget was already taken up by public safety. That includes police and firefighter and fire department expenses. And then there's the issue of accountability as well. And this is the issue that Fix SAPD is focused on. You write in the book about going back and looking at the 1988 police contract, and that sort of that helped shape your understanding of what had gone wrong. The 88 contract was derided even back then after the public found out about it. Extremely generous, overly generous, and not maybe in the best interest of the public. But by the time we get to 2010, it's been more than 30 years at that point. Why do you think that mayors and city councils and city managers, frankly, as well, in all of those years basically had failed to correct that? What are the dynamics that you saw that prevented that? Because in theory, it could have been fixed, right, in that process. And you saw that there too. What was the challenge in actually doing it?
Well, I think I'm fairly certain they wanted to do it, and they recognized that there were issues. A few things happened back in 1988 And I will say that I spent a couple of days at the Texana room at the Central Library, just pouring through the newspaper clippings. The actual clippings were in the files from 1988. It was fascinating to read the history and the commentary that was happening at that time. And I've talked with some of those who were actively involved at that moment. I know that in Nelson Wolf's book, he was on the city council that approved those contracts in 1988. In his book, he said that that decision did more to damage the credibility of local government than anything else they did at the time. And I think a couple of things contributed to that. There was a union president at the time who had been shot in the line of duty, had multiple surgeries, was looking for a better health care plan. The city was also considering the construction of the Alamo Dome. And as reported in the newspapers at the time, the elected leadership did not want the unions to oppose that sales tax increase to build the Alamo Dome. And so there was kind of a coming together of all of these aspects that the city council approved, these overly generous contracts for the police. And because the police and fire have these Me Too clauses, then fire got what police got. But you know that not only did they have this excessive healthcare plan that was costing the city during my tenure up to $20,000 per employee, as to the $6,000 or $7,000 we were paying for healthcare for civilian employees, because we had remodeled those contracts and had the employees participating in wellness programs, all kinds of things, and a consumer-driven healthcare plan, health savings accounts. But the unions wouldn't budge on that issue. The other thing they did back in the day, and of course you know that that's when the legal fund was set up for the police and fire, where the city budgets $1.5 million a year to pay for their wills, estate planning, divorces, child custody disputes, and even criminal defense for they and their families. And I'd never heard of that. I'm not aware of another department in the country that has that kind of benefit. And that may have been okay back in 1988. I'm not passing judgment. But as the city manager in 2013 and 14, when we took this on, when you were mayor, I knew it wasn't sustainable. It wasn't even affordable anymore to do that. And so we needed to change some of those things. And one thing that they used to do, if they couldn't get what they wanted entirely from the city council, they'd go to the legislature to get changes for themselves. And they went to the legislature back in the late 80s and got an exemption to the city of San Antonio's city charter so that they could contribute and campaign for candidates for city council. And that's highly unusual in any city that has a professional council manager form of government, where no employees are supposed to be participating in the election process for elected officials. And so they got an exemption, and they're able to endorse and contribute and campaign. And I can recall several council members telling me, gosh, I felt like I was running against the fire union. They were out there in their shirts that aren't uniform but look very similar to their uniforms, campaigning for candidates. I remember a firefighter who retired to run for city council, and they would intimidate council members and say, if you don't give me what I want in this contract, we're going to run somebody against you. So I can imagine that the city managers in the past, as well as elected officials, were reluctant to take on this issue. And you can recall some of our conversations with the council back in the day when we began the process in 2013, that they said, okay, city manager, you be out front on this, you go forth, and wanted to stay a little bit in the background. And I can understand why they felt that way, because there was a considerable amount of intimidation that was happening by the unions. So those were factors that contributed to it. But and I didn't have to take this on either. there were several people who said, it's not going to bankrupt the city while you're city manager. Why don't you leave it for the next person? But we had worked so hard to improve the professionalism of the city. We'd earned a AAA bond rating. I had substantial labor experience from my own upbringing, as well as work in Michigan and Phoenix, that I thought I was in a position to take this on. Plus, I knew that I was approaching retirement from public service, and that what was the worst that could happen? The council would fire me. I mean, this was the right thing to do, but it was extremely difficult. I thought it would take a couple of years. It ended up taking 6 years to get to conclusion with the fire union. They refused to negotiate for many years, and that's in part because of the 10-year evergreen clause. So that 1988 contract had a lot of problems, and we corrected some of it, as you know from the book. Just in the current 5-year terms of the two contracts, police and fire, we've saved the city more than $150 million. But by the time we reached the mediated settlement with the police union, 2.5 years after the contract expired, or we began the negotiations, I think the mayor and council at that time had grown weary of the fight. And we didn't get the disciplinary changes in that mediated settlement, and I didn't want to settle until we were able to get that. But the council said, "Take what we got. Let's move on. This fight's been going on too long. Try to get that in the next contract." Well, the next contract's here. They're in negotiations now. I have very high confidence in Maria Villagomez. As you know, she was our budget director. I promoted her several times. She's now deputy city manager and leading the negotiating team. And she's holding her own, and the city council is supporting, the mayor and council are supporting the strategy to try to get these disciplinary changes. So we'll see what happens. But if it doesn't happen, the only way to go at it then is to rescind collective bargaining. That is allowed by state law. It was actually approved by the San Antonio voters in 1974 to allow collective bargaining. You have to go to the voters. Mayor, you'll appreciate this. When I looked at the research, it was a vote of 10,000 to 3,000 in the city of San Antonio that approved collective bargaining in 1974, a special election. And then in a separate election later that year, the fire union also got collective bargaining. But I think the public is very in tune, and that happened after the death of George Floyd last Memorial Day, and the protests started, and this became a very visible issue. I almost felt like I was ahead of my time trying to make these changes, but the time is right for the change to happen now.
And that's going to be on the ballot, that initiative, Proposition B. What do you make of that effort? Have you supported it? What do you see out there in terms of the landscape? And I know that after 4 decades being a city manager, you both have your hand in politics. There's no way to avoid that. I mean, you're all around it. And at the same time, you studiously have to avoid being, quote unquote, political or partisan, I should say. Now you're not. You're retired, semi-retired. I mean, what do you make of Proposition B? If a voter were to come up to you and say, "Hey, you were the city manager, you know a lot about these issues," what's your feeling on it?
Well, I think that the organizers have done a great job. O.G. Martin, I did watch the KSAT debate the other night. I think that the representatives who spoke actually for both sides were articulate. But what's happening here is the issue of police accountability. And the chief wants to have authority to fire bad officers, and he should have that. As you know, I met with the police chief every Monday morning. We talked almost every single day because in a major city, policing is very difficult. But as I said, there are only 2 ways to correct the situation. They either negotiate, and in my opinion, and perhaps this is, too logical, but I would have if I were them, I would have come forth now and said, yes, I am willing to do this, so that they didn't lose collective bargaining. Here are the things, and they've done a couple of minor things as what I've followed so far. But there are some major issues that the city is still pushing for and demanding from them through a very professional negotiating process that the unions haven't given in on yet. And they're the major points that need to change. So if they don't do that, then the public has the choice. Do we rescind collective bargaining? And because they still have an 8-year evergreen clause, the mediation only took off 2 years of that. They can string this out. And, the problem with tiny incremental change is that, we wait another 5 years till the next contract to make tiny more changes again. No, the public wants police accountability. They highly regard, I've seen the polling, and Bill McManus is still well regarded professionally in the community. They trust his judgment, and he is the person that's held accountable. But if he has to take back bad officers, then that's not good for our community. So the two choices are, they either come forth before early voting starts on April 19th and say, yes, we will make the changes that the city is accommodating, or the public has the choice and perhaps should consider rescinding collective bargaining. It's not the best approach, and yet, what is the choice that the public has? These are complicated issues. There's another statute that also governs San Antonio, Chapter 143 of the Local Government Code. And if collective bargaining is rescinded, we revert to those rules that collective bargaining has allowed us to modify. And yet, I know that fixsapd.org is and continues to collect signatures to rescind Chapter 143 that also has some archaic rules for police and fire. That law was adopted by San Antonio voters back in 1947. And that was a vote of like 6,000 to 5,000 back in the day. So, and that was even before the council manager form of government. And I'm told those who have done some research on the issue that was put in place to try to prevent cronyism before there was professional management within the city of San Antonio. So, and my book is really about changing old business models. And I think what we've learned in the pandemic, too, is that just because we've always done it that way doesn't mean that we can't take a look at it and make changes and improvement. And that's really what this effort is about. How do we be more responsible to the public? How do we be more transparent? How do we gain greater confidence in our policing of the community? We have outstanding professionals running those departments. So let's give them the tools they need to ensure that the public is best protected and is engaged in the conversation about how we are policing our San Antonio.
Well, and speaking of changing old business models, I mean, your very presence in many ways throughout your career at these top level positions in city management was a change of the business model, because like so many other professions, it's been very male dominated. You are one of a handful of women in the industry that has had longevity and achieved excellence. And not to say that there haven't been very many talented women who have either tried or even served in those positions they have, but oftentimes they encounter many of the same obstacles that women encounter when they go into the legal profession or other professions. Talk to me about your reflections on 4 decades of working in an industry that has been so male dominated. How did you deal with that? And maybe a story or two that you have. What you done.
Well, and I would add to what you just said, Mayor, Secretary, that white male dominated in the profession as well. White men, not as many people of color. That's changed some. over the years, but there still are fewer people of color and women in the top leadership positions. And I've spent time, you know, that I initiated a women's leadership mentoring program during my tenure as city manager in San Antonio so that we could pair senior executive females with junior and help them achieve their goals, among other programs we did for all of our training for staff. But yes, as a female, I was the first female in every position I held in my public career over 45 years. But for San Antonio, there was a female city manager before I was, although it was a short amount of time, and there was some controversy during her tenure. Nonetheless, being the first, you have to set the example. You know, I'm the oldest of 7 children. I remember growing up, my parents reminding me as when I was entering high school, now you have 6 younger brothers and sisters that are following you. So you have to be on your best behavior. Otherwise, they will be, if you do wrong things, then they will be tainted by your bad behavior. So you have to be an example. And I think that I had to perform in all of those first level positions as a female much better. I had to be twice as good as a man would be to be able to be effective and successful. I've joked a couple of times about a story. Bill McManus and I would go out on National Night Out and visit as many of the neighborhood meetings and gatherings as we could to thank the residents for the work they were doing for their neighborhoods. And several times, of course, all of the, or many of the women would want to have their picture taken with the chief. And they would turn to me and say, "Oh, are you the chief's wife?" And no, it would be his boss, but okay. But you know, the old assumptions. And I will say that in this fight with the unions, I do not believe that they would have treated a man like they treated me. They were very vicious. That were said and posted, and the intimidation techniques, derogatory comments. You know, they ran TV ads prime time that several staff have estimated, in talking with the media, have estimated the union spent more than $1 million on TV ads against me as though I were a candidate for office. And there were business people who wanted to run ads countering that. And I said, no, that's good money after bad. Let's stay focused on what we're trying to achieve, stay professional. We're not going to get into the gutter with them. We're going to rise above that, make sure the facts are out there. But in the rise of social media age, that was difficult because they were putting out so much misinformation. So I think I was treated differently throughout my career. As a woman, I was held to a higher standard, but you know, I work hard. I spent a lot of time and effort to assemble very professional staff and hopefully train those and develop successor leadership for the organization. So I was up to the task, but it was tough going. There's no question. And I liked what you said about other women who could have been in the positions. There are so many women that went before me who could have been city managers, but just were not allowed to be in those positions. And even when I started in my career in Michigan, I remember being in the late 1970s at a women work kind of seminar, and they said, "What do you want to be?" And I said, "I want to be the city manager." And I remember a woman turning to me and saying, "Don't you think that's a stretch? Don't you think that's not possible?" And nothing makes me work harder than being challenged that you can't do this, than to take it on and be successful.
Because there are a lot of just spectacularly talented younger professionals, women that are coming up through the ranks in San Antonio and communities across the country. What is your advice to them after going through 40 years of successes and battling the battles and you know, seeing people come and go? What would you say to that 26-year-old young staffer who also wants to be city manager or some other executive position?
Well, there are no entitlements. You have to complete your education. And Mayor, I have to compliment you on the work, your initiative and concept and vision for San Antonio with the early childhood education program, pre-K for SA. I'm a big believer in education. My father, after he finished a career in the trade, then taught high school for another 20 years, and education is the key to this generational poverty issue and achieving more. So you have to not only get an undergraduate degree, but a master's degree in a field that pertains to the work that you want to do. And you have to work harder than everyone else. You want to be the person that's the go-to. Not that I set out to do it, but in Phoenix, I was, if you want to get something done at City Hall, go talk to Sheryl about it. And there were others as well, but I became one of those individuals that people knew they could seek out to get something done. And you want to be the person that does present a lot more work, but you want to work harder than everyone else and make sure that you're delivering. Proof is in performance. And if you can deliver a bond program within budget, quality projects, on time, people have and gain confidence. So for city managers as well, and I'll use the small p in political, you have to develop some political capital. That is, we didn't tackle the union contracts initially. There were so many other things that needed to be addressed. How we handled street maintenance, garbage collection, turning around development services, and the multitude of problems that existed there. We had to take care of the basics first before we took on some of the bigger issues. And then if you do well, then people have confidence in your work and they're willing to trust that you know what you're doing and can take on those bigger issues. And the other thing too is to collaborate and talk to the community. In my first year as manager, I was out breakfast, lunch, and dinner 7 days a week, meeting with the community and listening to what they were saying about how they wanted their local government to perform. And I continued to do that. I pulled together 3 community panels when we were selecting a new police chief to get input from everyone, not to select the chief. I knew that was my responsibility and job, but to hear from them. So you have to be out there, and time and again I would hear, gosh, no city managers ever come to my office. Thanks for talking with me. Ethel Miner told me that when I went to visit her at the NAACP offices. And so just being out there and being real, and even participating in fun activities like corneation during Fiesta. And I know you were there. You were running for mayor at that time. I was a little nervous when I saw you in the audience, I have to confess. But it makes people real. So they need to know that you're listening to them and that you're a person too and trying to do the best for the community.
But I want to sort of broaden our focus for a second to your adopted home, which is San Antonio. I mean, you had spent a lot of years in city management before you got to San Antonio, including right before you came here in Phoenix. And for decades, Phoenix was regarded as one of the best run cities in the country. In the 1980s and early 1990s, Phoenix and San Antonio were neck and neck in terms of population. And then Phoenix just skyrocketed. And I think today it's probably the 5th or 6th largest city in the country. How do you compare those two cities, Phoenix and?
Well, Phoenix is such a young city. I was there after I was there for 5 years. People thought I was native, whereas in San Antonio, I was here for 5 years, and people would come up to me and still say, "Welcome to San Antonio," and I'd say, "Hey, I've been here for 5 years now," and they'd say, "Yes, welcome to San Antonio." So there's so much history and culture here, and a culture that must be respected because people have worked very hard to maintain and develop a city that has a personality. It's not just new and people moving in. You know, Phoenix was a place where people would leave California, come to Phoenix, pay cash for their house because, you know, of the escalating costs in California, and they were leaving for all kinds of reasons. And I happened to be there during the boom era, where the population almost doubled during my tenure there, and worked on very large bond programs and major projects. As a city manager, it was a dream because I was working on numerous once in a lifetime kinds of projects to advance the community. And one of the things we worked on there was the downtown Arizona State University campus, to develop that, which now has more than 10,000 students living and attending school downtown, connected to the Tempe campus by light rail. We worked on the light rail while I was there. But it's similar in size, similar in demographics, but a much newer community. And so San Antonio, though, has a much higher poverty level and generational poverty, as well as economic segregation. And I remember the first time I saw Christine Drennan's analysis of school districts and how they developed here in San Antonio, and saw the redlining from 100 years ago that intentionally made some areas of the community inferior to other areas of the community. It clicked with me, and I said, okay, that's why when I go out to different neighborhoods and I'm overwhelmed with the poor street condition and no sidewalks and inability of our lesser services, how did this happen? And so we worked hard, as you know, to try to correct some of those inequities, but it's a work in progress. We still have a lot more to do. So Phoenix is newer, maybe has a little bit shinier reputation. They had so many excellent staff. It was considered, we won this Bertelsmann Prize as the best managed city in the world, tied with Christchurch, New Zealand, back in the early 90s. And I remember when I first went there thinking, I wish I could just take a few of these folks and send them back to Kalamazoo, Michigan to help there. No one would even miss them here. There are so many outstanding staffers. But that takes time to develop. That didn't happen overnight. And I think we worked hard over my tenure as manager over the 14 years to develop an even stronger team that existed than when I came in 2005. And that's happening. But demographically, in terms of the makeup of the population, it's similar size. Phoenix is a little bit bigger, but we now are over 500 square miles. We manage 4,000 miles of streets. I know I've run quite a few of those in my running career, and there's still work to do. But I hope people believe we made progress. $2 billion in general obligation bond programs, primarily for streets, sidewalks, and drainage, parks, libraries, are what we did in those 3 bond programs in 07, 12, and 17. And another one's coming up in 2022. So I know the staff will be working hard with the community to develop those programs and take them to the voters as well next spring.
Absolutely. And I would just encourage folks who are watching, if you have a question, we're going to take questions in just a minute. I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll jump into audience questions. Please submit them in the chat, and maybe we'll ask your question. So over the years, when people meet you, there is one thing, and you may know where this is going, that they remember from the first time they meet. They say that Sheryl has the strongest handshake of anybody, man or woman, that they've ever met. I have experienced that myself. Where does this otherworldly handshake come from? And you must be doing it on purpose, Sheryl, because this thing was so firm. Your hand, you didn't literally break people's knuckles, but it was a very firm handshake. When did you decide to do that, and what is that meant to convey?
Early in my city management career back in Michigan, because I was the first woman and I'd be the only woman in the room. And, men would come up to me and kind of grab my fingers, like they were afraid to touch my hand and I just decided, oh, come on. I mean, we're all professionals here. Just shake hands. And, as I've tried to teach my kids, or if I speak to a high school class, you want to have eye contact as well. Firm handshake, eye contact, so that people know you're serious and you mean well. I don't mean to break hands, but I think because people thought women were weaker, or they just couldn't be in the position. Both of my children were born when I was city manager of Kalamazoo, Michigan. I worked till I was in labor. I remember being in the office the day my son was born. And I knew I was in labor in the morning, but I'd had a long labor with my daughter. So I thought, well, I don't have to rush over to the hospital. So I went ahead and did my meetings until noon, and then met the doctor at the hospital with my husband at 1:00. And Colin was born at 7 that evening. So, you have to go do it. And many people thought, oh, did you take months off? I'm like, well, with Colin, I only took 2 weeks off and went back as city manager because we were in the middle of the budget process. It's in part because women early in my career, there weren't other women around. So everyone was watching. How is she going to act? How will she perform? So I thought, okay, handshake's an easy thing. Then they know I'm serious, and that's carried over.
Yeah, no, and I think that it's had that effect, right? It puts people on notice right away that you are serious. Okay, so let's jump into questions. I encourage folks, if you have a question, to put it into the chat, and let's see what we get here. We have a question from Sherry about whether you're still running. You are a runner. In fact, if I remember right, you were instrumental in bringing the Rock and Roll Marathon to San Antonio, and you have run it yourself on more than one occasion. Talk to us about, I still remember, in fact, you telling me once that the average age for a marathoner was 51. But how did you get into running? And do you still run? You're semi-retired.
I'm not really running much anymore. I call it wogging. You walk a little, maybe jog a little. My fast running days and long distance running days are, I'm afraid, over. For the first time in my life a few years ago, I started developing some knee problems. So I'm really not supposed to be running anymore, but I'm doing much more cross training, and I still work out every single morning. I'm an early workout person, and I did the elliptic for 45 minutes this morning before jumping in the shower to do this program. But I'm an advocate for fitness, and I think if you're going to be successful, you have to be physically and mentally fit. When I came to San Antonio, so many of my department heads were overweight and stressed and tired and hypertensioned, and so we put a program together to give everyone an annual physical. And I don't want to know the details, but I want people to know what their issues are. And so many were grateful and said, gosh, that's the first time I've had a comprehensive physical. I also required them to take off at least 2 weeks a year before they were eligible for any performance pay. Many of them said, gosh, I haven't been away. Now, I'm not a real good example for that. I took 1 2-week vacation my entire tenure as a city manager in San Antonio, because it's a full-time 24/7 job, as you know. The Rock and Roll Marathon, people knew, and I've run 9 full marathons in my life. I didn't start running marathons distance till after I turned 40. I was a swimmer and worked as a lifeguard in high school and college. And then when I had to get a real job and work inside after I graduated from college, I took up running and was a 10K amateur, just for fun, competitive runner. And then as my 40th birthday approached, I thought, I wonder if I could run that far, and met Joan Benoit Samuelson and got her book. and thought, I'm going to follow her training program and see if I could do that, and decided I'd run the Chicago Marathon because it was the same weekend as my mother's birthday. So I was living in Phoenix at the time, and I thought, well, I can go back, see my mom, multitask, run a marathon, and then come back. And trained methodically, ran it and said, it wasn't so hard. Then ran New York, then decided to run competitively and qualified for Boston.
And what was your best time?
My best time was 3:40 full marathon. That was qualifying. I qualified in St. George, Utah, at 3:40, and that was at age 47. So that's a sub 8-minute mile for 26 miles. I was in pretty good shape then. Not the same shape I'm in today, but I really enjoyed running. And it was my private time and thinking time. So I could go out and run and think through issues for the day, personnel issues, even issues, the kids might be having some kind of conflict or need help on an issue, and go out and run and think clearly and put that together. And also when I came to San Antonio, on the weekends, for my long runs, I would go out to a different part of the city and just run. So I could learn the city, the parks, the streets. It became patently obvious that we needed to do a lot of work in terms of street maintenance, which we did. Also stray dogs. I had to run with pepper spray when I first came to town because there were so many strays. And we work very hard and have an outstanding animal care services department now, and have reduced our kill rate and the adoptions, and that's really turned around. So I'm not running anymore like I was, but I'll drive down the street and see people out running, and it makes me sad but happy for the community, because when I first came here, I didn't see a lot of dunners. But now I see people out running everywhere, and even on the Riverwalk. We live downtown, and during COVID, I was just elated to see so many people and running and exercising. That's a good thing for San Antonio. And yes, I ran the full the first year, and then the half marathons for several years in San Antonio, and then I did the relay of the half marathon as my running distance has decreased. But I ran all 12. This year they, I think, had a virtual event, but I didn't participate this year.
There you go. Well, and we're going to wrap up in just a moment, but I wanted to ask you as we close, those word association games that people play, if somebody said to you, San Antonio, what's the first thought that goes through your head?
I love this city. It is, it's a little bit of a conflict for me. I was brought in to make a lot of change and turnaround. And oftentimes I know you and I would debate, Phil Hardberger and I would debate, does the city really want to get better? Or it is a secret to the country. I brought the rating agencies here because they didn't believe that we were this booming metropolis. And I said, there's so much going on there, so much more that we can do. But I do love this city. So I'd say it's, for me, has some of the deepest memories for me and best memories for the kinds of changes that we were able to make for the residents here. That's a lot of words, one word for you, but.
Oh, it's okay. Well, again, congratulations on your book, Greedy Bastards. And I hope that folks who are watching who haven't had a chance to pick it up will pick it up. That's part of what.
Well, thanks. Yeah, it's of course available on Amazon, and there's also for the runners out there or people who work out or cycle. There's an Audible version as well. I taped it in my own voice last fall. So, yeah. And thank you, Mayor, Secretary, and friend Julian Castro for moderating this session.
Thank you, Sheryl. And thank you again to each and every one of you for joining us and to the organizers of our great book festival. Thanks, Sheryl.